Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Buck, and on behalf of the Board of Directors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Day 2 of the 2023 Open Education Conference. We hope you have found great value and inspiration from our presenters and live and recorded sessions and from fellow community members during the breakout sessions. Our plenary today features a keynote presentation by the incredible Professor Jasmine Roberts-Cruz. Professor Roberts-Cruz is a lecturer in the School of Communication at Ohio State University, where she teaches public relations writing, digital activism, and campaign strategy. Her advocacy work centers on the experience of people of color, women, and queer communities. Along with her communication expertise, Professor Roberts-Cruz is also a renowned open education leader. She has delivered numerous keynote presentations across the country on the topics of social justice and open education, and has had TEDx talk titled, "I'm Tired of Talking About Race." She has provided consulting to several open education organizations on how to dynamically embody social justice and equity in practice. She is also the author of the openly licensed book, Writing for Strategic Communication Industries. In her spare time, she loves to connect with her wife, fur babies, 2 dogs, and green babies, 50 plants total. Welcome, Professor Roberts-Cruz. Over to you.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for that warm introduction, Stephanie. Thank you to everyone who's decided to join me and to just hold this space with me. I did want to let you all know that unfortunately the last day I kind of came down with a slight head cold. So if at any point in time while I'm talking, you hear kind of like a pause, it's because I muted myself and I don't want you all to hear me like coughing in your ear. But I'm well enough to, really share some of the ideas that I've been thinking about this past year, honestly. And so the title of my talk is kind of long. I actually only included part of it on the first slide here. And that is, there has to be another way when we're thinking about how do we create pathways towards liberation and open education. And I want to essentially use what we call a post-oppositional approach to social justice and open ed. What does that mean? I'll talk about that in just a second or so. So I am that person who likes to give a roadmap to kind of let you all know where I'm going to be taking you all. So I am going to be doing a lot of acknowledgements. The first, I would say 10 minutes of the talk. So I did want to preface that because if you have heard me talk before, I kind of take my time in discussing the acknowledgements. So if it seems a little long, it's just the Jasmine way of doing things. And then I do want to talk a little bit about my positionality and of course celebrate just the past 20 years of this type of event going on. I also want to take you all through some concerns that I have, some concerns that I've been thinking about not just this past year, but for a while. And I just didn't have the language to figure out how exactly to articulate some of those concerns. And then I want to go ahead and introduce this term post-oppositional or post-oppositionality. Some of you might have heard of it, but I think it's a really applicable approach to the work that we do, especially in relation to justice and open education. I also want to introduce this resistance and process that I'm thinking about. That concept hasn't really been fleshed out, but I kind of just want to pose it to you all and see what you think. And then end with this construct called radical hope, because I think that's certainly something that we need, especially with everything that's going on in the world. So like I said to you all, I begin my talks with going through a lot of acknowledgements. However, again, if you've heard me talk before, you know that I feel very conflicted about land acknowledgements. On one hand, I think it's important to pay respect and recognize the land that I live on, which is the ancestral homeland of the Shawnee, Ojibwa, Wyandot, and Delaware people. Every time I go hiking, I think of these people and how well they took care of the land and how true to their belief that if you take care of the land will take care of you. I strongly believe it's important to listen to Indigenous people, right, on this issue of territory acknowledgements. It's important to not just acknowledge, but to connect what seems like long ago histories to present day realities. I often reflect on the Land Grab University project, where there were 2 people who traced how land grant institutions in the United States in particular have financially benefited from the theft of Indigenous lands. They looked at the Morrill Act of 1862 and other legislation that essentially benefited land grant institutions. So the image that's on the slide here is showing how my home institution, Ohio State University, benefited from this massive transfer of wealth from indigenous lands to university endowments. And I think it's also important to note, as Summer Wilkie, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and a University of Arkansas student coordinator for Indigenous people, it's important to note what she said in High Country News, excuse me, and that is, I think she said something to the degree that it's sad that the simple acknowledgement of stolen land and centuries of historical and cultural erasure feels like progress. Wilkie goes on to say how, quote, a land acknowledgement doesn't even begin to address the lack of representation of Native people in institutions of higher education. She reminds us, quote, until action is taken to identify and empower Indigenous people, land-based justice is carried out. And inaccurate history is no longer taught in schools. A land acknowledgement statement feels mostly empty, even belittling and alienating. So action has to follow the acknowledgement of injustice. And then another acknowledgement that I often do, and I'm not necessarily going to do in the same way that I usually do, I just want to remind you all that in the year 2111, that is, and none of us will be alive, at least I don't think so at that point. That is the first year that Black Americans in the US will be free longer than they have been enslaved since they were taken from their homelands to engage in forced labor. I want to pay respect and acknowledge the forced labor of enslaved Africans in this country and how, and in the US in particular, I should say, and how this tremendously contributed to the US economy, culture, and social structure. I also want to draw your attention to this report from US Representative Cori Bush. And this report shows to what degree the US has benefited from the enslavement and forced labor of people, of African people, and their descendants. And so the slide reads, the US has benefited from over 220 million hours of forced labor since the first enslaved Africans were brought here to work on stolen land. That amounts to roughly 14 trillion, at least 14 trillion Black enslaved folks and their descendants are owed. And so I also want to acknowledge that I am an extension of this reality. I am a descendant of the Sera and Wolof people from what is now known as Senegal, the Mbundu people from what is now known as Angola, and the Igbo people from what is now known as Nigeria, and many other people groups from the continent of Africa who I am not able to trace and call on more specifically because they were stolen from their home countries, their home in general, and forced to work on stolen land under the cruelest of conditions, forced to abandon their languages, their rituals. They were given European names and they were never seen as fully human, but they knew they were. They never lost hope of that. And they had the audacity to believe firmly in their humanity, their dignity, and I gained my determination and hope from my ancestors. I am indeed a very determined human, and I really didn't have a choice because yes, I come to you in this keynote as a wife, as an auntie, as a sister, but I am also the daughter of Leslie Nicole, who you see in the cream suit there, who is the daughter of Catherine Diane, who you see in the blue dress on the top right-hand corner, who was the daughter of Evelyn Otis Dean, who you see actually in the pink on the bottom right hand. And then she was the daughter of Willie Ella, who is in the teal on the bottom left-hand corner. And Willie Ella hailed from Selma, Alabama. She was a sharecropper and cook. And she also lived in Cleveland, Mississippi. And later, as a part of the Great Migration, she moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and owned her own business at a time when Black women very rarely could be entrepreneurs. And yes, I know I look just like my mother. That little baby was me. I come from a family of educators, not just in the formal sense, but in the sense of people who had the audacity to teach their descendants their history. When the world told them their history, their contributions of their people didn't matter. I bring all of this ancestral wisdom to today's keynote. I'm deeply, deeply connected to this history, contrary to popular belief that this history is so far from our present reality, again, especially in the US. And then the last thing I want to note before I really get into the content specific of the keynote, I want to dedicate this keynote to the people in Sudan, Congo, and Gaza who were going through unimaginable horror. I struggled with creating this keynote because people are dying right in front of our eyes. I struggled with whether my message would strike an insensitive or even privileged tone when thousands of people are literally fighting for their lives. But I wanted to, at least at a bare minimum, make space for this and acknowledge this painful reality for our humanity. And to be upfront, I unapologetically center the knowledge and stories of Black women in the US in this keynote. Black women are a group who are constantly asked to provide solutions, but are seldom supported and helped in a way that is meaningful to them. I am not aiming for neutrality or to be objective. I am aiming for justice. And so, to paraphrase something that Gloria Ladson Billings said when she actually came to Ohio State for a qualitative methods institute over the summer, she said in her keynote, let us be less concerned about holding objective standards and more concerned with holding standards of justice and fairness. So I just want to take the time to say how incredibly humbled I am to be here at this keynote as one of the conferences. It is very surreal. I have to be extremely honest with you all. It's surreal to be one of the keynotes with Rajiv Jhangiani. His work I admired ever since I heard about open education, heard about this community. So again, it's still something that I'm kind of processing here. I recall my first Open Ed event, which actually was OE Global Conference in Cape Town, South Africa, way back in 2017, way back. I decided to fly all the way across the world by myself because I had to see whether this group of educators, librarians, students, advocates, administrators, policymakers, instructional designers, you name it. I had to see whether or not I had truly found my people in higher education, the people who embody and are advocating for the notion that education is a public good and it is more importantly a human right. At the time, I was really excited to share my recent experience of writing an open textbook for my students and the impact on their learning experience. I want to thank the Affordable Learning Exchange program at Ohio State that kind of helped my impetus into open education. That program will always hold a special place in my heart. I got into open education because of the cost savings narrative. I had personal experience with this issue, reflecting on my previous experiences as an undergraduate student, and I knew I didn't want my students to have the same experience in my classroom. And it's honestly really, really amazing to see just how much this community has grown, how much, in some ways it's been challenged in a good way, how this community has reflected and again, continues to hold a very unique place in the way that I think about education. I'm also honored to be here because I am not always allowed, air quotes, to speak on the issues in a way I'd like to, because who I am, what I believe in as a scholar, my ethos, and just how I move in the world is being threatened on a societal as well as on a political level. So earlier this year, I was invited to keynote an open education conference. I submitted the title of my keynote, and it had the phrase reparative justice in it. Immediately when I sent the title of the talk, or at least not shortly after, I was actually uninvited as the keynote because I had the phrase reparative justice in the title. I was not issued any type of apology. I was not given the opportunity to revise the title of my talk. I was just told simply, you are no longer allowed to be one of the keynotes for this event. And so I was very shocked, y'all. I was like, wait a minute. All I want to do is just speak about justice and equity and education. But there are a couple of things that were going through my mind. Number one, this notion of reparative justice and this backlash against it, I think there's this sentiment of, in order for someone to really be open to having conversations about reparative justice, you have to admit that there was harm done, right? And then also, it really caught me off guard because you can't really speak about education equity or inequity without speaking about educational justice or injustice, right? And so I don't want to necessarily make this just about me, because I am not the only social justice oriented scholar of color who has experienced this type of thing, especially in the last year or so. I'm going to circle back to this to kind of show you all how we can still have radical hope in times of, backlash and turmoil that we're seeing, not only in the US and Canada, but also around the world. And so many of you know that I think a great deal about social justice and open, or how open education interacts with social justice. So it's been a joy to see how we are talking about social justice and open ed, despite some of the efforts to censor these conversations. And I know, depending upon where you're located in the US, for those who are in the US, I should say, it is easier in other places than in others. But however, this also has a global imperative, because the pursuit for social justice and open ed means we have to talk about these issues globally as well. So I've been so inspired by specific works that I just want to mention that are listed here on the slide. So the article, A Social Justice Framework for Understanding OERs and Practices in the Global South by Cheryl Hodgkins Williams and Henry Trotter. That was actually my first social justice oriented / open ed article that made me think, oh my gosh, there's a place for this. It really challenged me to think about social justice beyond the global north. And so I want to thank and honor those authors for that work. Framing OEPs, or Open Educational Practices from a Social Justice Perspective, by Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, and of course, Rajiv Jangiani. That article helped me to understand that it's not enough just to incorporate open practices that are not rooted in social justice, because otherwise we'd be reproducing dominant epistemologies. And then, of course, also changing our discourse, a distinctive social justice aligned definition of open ed, by the wonderful Sarah Lambert. Sarah, we have not met in person. That is like my goal for the next couple of years. But Sarah's social justice principles, like I like to call them, have really helped me to have language to describe some of the things that I've been wanting to describe in open ed, but I just didn't have that language. And I know her work is informing a lot of us as it relates to social justice. And so I am proud to present a new research framework that I hope some of you will find helpful. While this is not the focus of my keynote, I wanted to let you all know of this new exciting project. So Virginia Clinton Lassell, Lindsay Gavush, and myself recently wrote a paper. And Virginia, if you're in the chat, if you want to drop that preprint in there, if you feel comfortable, I forgot to do that. But we will share it, of course, with everyone once it's like actual like final. But this paper basically explains a new framework that we're calling the SCOPE framework. And so the SCOPE framework builds upon the COUP framework. The COUP framework has been and continues to be an important framework for open education. And we wanted to build on that so that it explicitly mentions social justice, right? And so what we mean by explicitly mentioning social justice, we mean positioning social justice at the forefront. So leading with social justice, which we define as both liberatory and a corrective practice. And that practice manifests in the equitable distribution of resources and opportunities for the goal or for the sake of people obtaining their full rights, whether that's economic rights, political rights, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so leading with social justice will help us to ask more critical research questions that help to dismantle inequitable systems and practices. Questions such as, what are the social political costs, right? So we're not just looking at cost savings, but perhaps emotional costs for faculty of color who participate in open practices. What ways do students of color engage in open ped projects? What ways do students with disabilities engage in open pedagogy projects? Another question might be, what ableist systems or situations create barriers for students with disabilities in an open ed context? Another question might also be, what are students of color's perceptions of open pedagogy projects if they are in a situation, and I want to really thank Lindsay for bringing this to our attention, if they're in a situation where they're the only student of color, what is that experience like? Will they feel tokenized, right? Does this unintentionally lead to tokenization or tokenism, I should say? The scope framework also teases out the notion of engagement by considering the ways in which people are fully participating in being actively involved in open education. I know Tillinghast and their colleagues argue that engagement should be included in the COOP framework. And so that is something that we've tried to do here in the scope framework. So I'm very excited to see what comes from this new research framework, excuse me. And I really invite people to read this paper, to provide us with feedback, any type of feedback, and to build upon this framework because it truly is a work in progress. And so, since I am thinking a lot about justice, with that comes, to be honest with you, some concerns, some things that do kind of keep me up at night. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but these are things that really do give me anxiety, give me concern with everything that's going on in the world. I'm getting concerned about these things because, many of us are trying to go deeper in this path towards social justice. The first concern that I have is the amount of fatigue, despair, as I list there, and the lack of care that appears to be happening as a result of doing social justice labor. I want to acknowledge something that may or may not be obvious. I want to acknowledge that these systems that many of us are trying to dismantle are also designed to tire us out, okay? And they're most certainly designed to make us feel despair. I actually think that there is a lot of value in truly feeling these feelings that are bound to come up in social justice. I actually heard somewhere, it might have even been on social media, but I do like it. I heard somewhere someone saying you can't heal without feeling, right? There is no healing without feeling. And so I want to hold space for that. Yet I am concerned that this despair has become all consuming. I am concerned that we are approaching these issues of education inequities, systemic silencing, and the epistemic injustices that we are seeing as if they are new, instead of looking at how, while there is a blueprint for oppression, and there is a history of this, there is also a history and a blueprint for resistance, and which I'll talk about later on. I'm wondering how we can reach back and look back in order to engage and care, and in order to sustain the efforts that we need, so that we don't get stuck in despair and feelings of overwhelm. This reaching back, I think, is really, really critical and reminds me of the Sankofa principle of the Akan people in Ghana that states, quote, "One should remember the past to make positive progress in the future." So this is a really, at least to me, this is a really powerful way that we can sustain ourselves, and differs from how Western traditions position time and progress as a linear, straightforward path. And I'm also thinking of something that Toni Morrison said, excuse me, I'm not sure in what context, but I do have the quote somewhere here. Let me pull it up here. Oh yes, she said, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore this pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to it. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom." So these are, again, that's just kind of the first concern that I've been thinking about a lot, this being all consumed with despair and fatigue as well. The second one that I wanted to unpack here is I'm concerned with the lack of support that people who engage in social justice labor, the lack of support they receive or don't receive, I should say. Earlier, I shared my story of how I was essentially censored, but my case was not a one-off, but a trend that we're seeing and will continue to see for quite some time. At least that's what I'm thinking. Um, in some ways I was disappointed in how it came down, but I do want to thank, for example, the Rios community for being a tremendous source of support, and other people who I talked to one-on-one or on a one-on-one basis who supported me in ways that I noticed. But again, this isn't just about me. I've always asked the question, what is the ask of people who are doing social justice labor, who disproportionately tend to be women of color and or people from the global South? How do we support these individuals when they are putting a lot of things on the line? Angela Davis, she talked about how when she was arrested and sent to prison in the 1970s, her way of engaging in radical self-care was actually through communal care. How her community showed up for her was critical. And she talks about how she would not have gotten through that very difficult period without her community. And so we've been reflecting on what Rajiv said yesterday in terms of community is a verb. And I challenge you all to think about what we need to do to embody radical communal care in open education. How do we become a group that embodies radical communal care? And then my last concern, and it's a little controversial to voice, I have to be honest with y'all, but I wouldn't be who I am without being some type of provocateur. I am concerned with the amount of policing of activism that I have seen outside of open ed, where, there's this sort of, how do I describe it, as tribalism, this binary that we have to adhere to in order to dismantle the systems that we are trying to address. So I believe this actually flattens and restricts and oversimplifies pathways towards justice. There's this notion that if you're not doing all the things in the hidden curriculum of activism, somehow you are wrong. You are not a real advocate, or you are not a real activist. And while, let me be very, very clear, y'all, I do believe in performative activism. In terms of I believe it's a problem. And that if you're doing activism that only serves to make you feel comfortable, I would challenge you to think about who you are actually trying to help. Both instances are really harmful and completely take away from the work that, the hard work that social justice advocates have been doing for quite some time. But I don't want us to conflate that with, meaning I don't want us to conflate performative activism with those who are trying to figure out how they can engage in these issues in a meaningful way, whether that be through reading, writing, researching, other things that can also contribute to activism, can contribute to dismantling some of these systems. So this brings me basically to the heart of my argument, and that is this notion of post-oppositionality. Again, some of you might have heard of this. It's okay if you haven't. That's the whole purpose of the keynote. I recently learned of this notion of post-oppositionality, and I think it addresses some of the concerns that I went into a lot of detail about. So post-oppositionality is a term coined by Anna Louise Keaton, who is a professor at Texas Women's University. So in her book, I think it was published back in 2013, titled Transformation Now, Anna Louise explains how post-oppositional politics, or she explains how post-oppositional politics is an approach and a practice that, quote, transcends oppositional consciousness and energies generally found in social justice work and academic critique. And while Anna Louise created this idea, she created the term, this idea behind it is not entirely new, because we have seen how other feminist scholars, Indigenous peoples, and women of color educators argue for a more interconnected, relational, post-binary way of approaching social justice. So it's important to note, as Anna Louise also explains in Transformation Now, that oppositional politics have been useful and helpful to survive and resist oppression, but that may not be enough to sustain social justice long term in terms of sustaining social justice efforts. So this actually addresses a little bit of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the fatigue many of us have experienced, many of us are going through right now, but especially those who are doing social justice labor. I wonder how much oppositional consciousness contributes to this fatigue, in that it gets us so locked into these frameworks, right? It's almost like it's almost a box, if you will, that oppositional consciousness might put us into long term, which again can be tiring because you don't really have a lot of places to go in a box, right? And so this also, and again, Anna Louise talks about this as well, points to how oppositional politics reinforces a strict "I'm right, therefore you are wrong" approach to liberation, and leaves little room for transformative futures that include, again, this is a quote from Anna Louise, it doesn't include maybe the contradictions, the overlapping perspectives, and the building of new truths. She goes on to say, as if we are defending ourselves when we are defending our positions, which oftentimes that's exactly how we feel. Okay. And so I will say that with post-oppositionality, it is not arguing for a type of civility that is often rooted in whiteness. It's not arguing for that, but it does engage in a gentle critique. It's also not anti-oppositional politics. I know that might sound like a contradiction. It's asking us to get away from the binary, right? It is a gentle critique, like I just mentioned here. And I've kind of thought of this phrase, resistance and, like, what comes after resistance, or resistance and the contradictions, resistance and the new truths, right? So the power of the and is what I'm thinking about here. What things, what traditions, and what practices make us difficult to imagine beyond these binaries that tend to come up in oppositional consciousness? So for me, post-oppositionality is much like the air. I'm going to give you a nature analogy, the air between branches or tree branches, right? So we notice the branches, they stick out, okay? Sometimes in opposing directions. We focus on this, right? When we see a tree, if we notice a tree, but we less often take note of the air or the wind blowing in between the branches. That's the space I'd like us to venture in open education as we look forward towards justice. And I also want to be clear in saying, again, that post-oppositional politics does not call us to ignore oppression or injustice for the sake of harmony, okay? But it does call for us to pause and to consider possibilities for liberation beyond maybe what an oppositional consciousness provides and sometimes polices. And so I'm asking us to kind of move beyond this, especially since it's so common in academic culture. And what kind of impact does oppositional binary way of thinking about liberation, what kind of impact does this have on us in terms of how we imagine liberation? Is there only one way for liberation open education? I certainly hope not. I think it's a lot more dynamic than that. And so as we're trying to imagine multiple pathways towards liberation, sometimes contradictions might appear. And I get it, it's really hard for us to kind of sit with these contradictions. We are not taught how to do this at all. How do we sit with, or how do I sit with the reality that sometimes I don't always want to do social justice all the time while calling myself a social justice scholar? Oftentimes I engage in social justice labor to survive these systems, right? Can I be an open education scholar, but also occasionally publish and close academic journals? These are real questions that some of us are thinking about. How is it that some women of color open ed practitioners are advocating for social justice within our higher education system, or even K through 12 system that has yet to embody social justice ethos and proxies? So they often find themselves, women of color open ed practitioners often find themselves negotiating white academic culture that undermines or contradicts their social justice ideologies. I think instead of thinking the only way towards liberation is to stop participating in these institutions, I think post-oppositionality allows for more complications, right? and again, allows for the nuances to really surface here. And so I encourage us, like Jackie Alexander says in one of her essays, that I encourage us to not think about this in a mono way, okay? Because they say that mono thinking is the mistaken notion that only one kind of justice leads to freedom. You know, may I dare ask us in open ed and encourage us for the next 20 years, plus years, beyond 20 years, to develop a sort of flexible epistemology that, you know, is not common in a world that thrives on rigidity. Is there an opportunity that multiple parties can be right at the same time? I would argue, sadly, that there are some people who would not be satisfied with this. But I think the most exciting thing about post-oppositionality as it applies to open ed is how it opens, no pun intended, opportunities to conceive new truths. So when the binaries are taken away, as I've written here on the slide, what are we left with in open education? And one of those new truths that I am excited about emerges from embracing the complex commonalities, even if we do come from vastly different perspectives. And so it's in these complex commonalities that there's an unveiling of a relational aspect that I think is really important to consider. But it is also important to clarify that these commonalities are not to be equated with sameness. It does not overlook the unique experiences people have or the unique differences that people have, but rather it holds space for these unique experiences in tangent with the points of connection. And that's what Ana Luis calls it as well. And I see this working really well for how we discuss the history of open education. So some of you know that for the past 2 years or so, I have been working really hard in centering the role of Black women in concepts related to open and how we talk about it. I really want to thank, I don't know if Marco is on the in the talk, but I really want to thank Marco Cifrele Valencia I just want to thank you so much for, your presentation in Open Ed 2020, because he did an amazing job of connecting Black feminist proxies to open education in terms of, if we really want to be on the pathway towards social justice, we need to look at Black feminist literature and Black feminist pedagogy. I knew very early on in my open ed journey, much of what had been told to me in terms of like what we had been thinking about in open ed. I thought to myself, I've kind of heard this somewhere else. Like, I've been here before, right? I have been working on an article that just recently got accepted where I explain and argue how Black feminism, among many other epistemologies from people of color, should be included in the history of open education because they have embodied open practices. And Black feminism is only but one perspective out of the many that we need to include in the historical discourse of open education. There are several pieces of work out there that attempt to detail the history of open in education, but they leave out or seldom mention the work of people of color or those from the global South, at least the publications that I'm looking at in the global North. Instead, these articles, they detail the history of open and open education. They talk about how it goes as far back as Socrates and movements like the open source movement, and mention people like Karl Popper and his open society concept, and how that later influenced the open source movement. But this again is an explicit centering of a white male lens when we're talking about the history of open. So if we are going to consider how, for example, in the history of open education in the US in the 1960s and 70s, there emerged an increasingly critical viewpoint of the educator as the sole authoritative figure, we would quickly realize that it was Black feminists during that time who were also raising those same questions and took it a step further and demonstrated how these assumptions were greatly racialized and gendered. And so I just want to make sure that when we are talking about our history of open education, that we are open to different perspectives and seeing the connections between other liberatory movements. I know Bell Hooks has done some similar methods that we can akin to open. Barbara Omalade has also done that in her classroom, right? Speaking of hooks, actually, there's a video of her circulating on social media where she is shown discussing how, even as a well-known Black feminist, she reads the work of patriarchal men. And I wanted to show you the clip, but we've already had a technological snafu, so I'm going to skip that and instead show you the actual quote from the video. So she says, I often felt wounded by white writers whose work speaks to me so deeply, but they just act as though we, women of color, people from the global South, don't exist. I think I read all kinds of work. I read patriarchal men whose work I love. But how is it that they can live without reading our work, without wanting to hear our voices? Even if it's just to be nosy, I love when she says that, to wonder what those people are thinking. She goes on to say, I mean, I live in the Bible Belt and I read lots of evangelical literature. And someone said to me, well, why do you bother? And I said, I like to know what millions of people are thinking. Part of the construction of the dominator privilege is you don't have to think about what are those other people thinking, what they are feeling, hoping, and dreaming. I think part of transformation is when you open yourself to wanting to know what those people who are not like you, what they are doing, what they are thinking, and how they are being. I just love that. So there's a little bit of intellectual humility that I'm asking us to have in open education. What makes us think that, any white man in open education, that their contributions to our history in open education, what makes us think that it's any more significant and meaningful than that of Black feminists and other people of color who have kind of been asking some of these same questions? How can we connect our work to some of these other liberatory education movements in a more meaningful way, since the impulse sometimes is very similar, okay? And I also want to mention another point before I turn to the latter part of my keynote. I'm also thinking about how do we not position open education as just reacting against traditional commercial publishing or high textbook costs, which again maintains a rigid binary. What would it look like, I guess, is what I'm asking, for us to see how open ed connects with, again, other liberatory education movements like Black feminist pedagogy. That's just one that I'm focusing on today, that have predated this whole commercial textbook versus open textbook discourse that is still, very common in open education. What other truths would emerge because we've kind of gone away from this binary? What other pathways would then open? So I think this is the true value in using a post-oppositional lens, is that you start to kind of see, these connections emerge, right? And so I think because post-oppositionality is very relational and really is based on the premise of interconnectedness, I think some of those truths, again, would emerge and we can kind of see some of those commonalities as well, and not position it as there's only one way or one path towards justice. And so I want to go ahead and turn to the latter part of my keynote. Since we did have kind of a technological thing earlier, I want to be kind of conscious of time, so I'm going to skip ahead a few things. And so I want to turn to this notion of radical hope, because I think in trying to sort out all of these complexities, I think it's important to talk about this, because I didn't realize until very recently that radical hope is what has been sustaining me. So radical hope is the audacity to anticipate a better world, to envision a better world, to still have desire for these things to actually happen, even in the midst of turmoil. And this is something that marginalized people who have been marginalized, this is something that has been very sustaining, especially, I would say. Radical hope is not a form of toxic positivity that doesn't leave room for the very real ways that we feel and respond to turmoil. But again, it's asking us, how do we sustain during that time? So kind of in the other words, if I can use Beyonce, like the "you won't break my soul" ethos. Okay. So Della Mosley from the University of Illinois or University of Florida, excuse me, and her colleagues wrote a really interesting article about what makes up radical hope. And they talk about how radical hope can be made up of four things: an understanding of the history of oppression, along with the history of resistance, embracing ancestral pride, envisioning equitable possibilities, and creating meaning and purpose in life by adopting an orientation to social justice. So in these four factors, I want to kind of show you all examples of that and have a little bit of time for Q&A after some of these examples. So in terms of understanding, an example of understanding the history of oppression, and also understanding the history of resistance and how that helps us with radical hope, I wanted to briefly share an amazing story of resistance, and that is the story of Mary Lumpkin. Mary Lumpkin was a mixed race woman born in 1832 in Virginia. Her mother was enslaved, and her father was both Mary and her mother's enslaver. Mary was later sold to a man by the name of Robert Lumpkin when she was around 8. Robert Lumpkin owned a slave jail and made his fortune based on this. His jail was not only a key site for domestic slave trading that happened after the international slave trade was illegal in the early 1800s, but it became a place where enslaved people were sent for brutal punishment if they tried to run away or do anything, right? The jail was an extremely brutal place, and it was actually nicknamed the Devil's Half Acre because it was so brutal. Some 200,000 enslaved people total were there during its existence. Mary was sexually abused by Robert and was forced to have 5 children with him, having her first child around 13 or 14. They actually eventually married, and shortly after the US Civil War, Robert died and left Mary with the property of the jail. But Mary had so much more in mind for this property. That was a place of bondage. She then, after Robert died, she then leased the land to abolitionist ministers who later used the space to create a school for formerly enslaved Black people. This place went from the name the Devil's Half Acre to God's Half Acre. And later on, it expanded and created one of the US's first HBCUs in Virginia. It became Virginia Union University, which is a school that still exists to this day. And pictured on this slide is one of her descendants, Dr. Kiralivia Heron, a professor at Howard University. And I share this story of Mary not to romanticize her abuse or even romanticize her strength that she had to have, but to share that we do have incredible stories of liberation in our history, and to look back at this blueprint to understand how to deal with some of this turmoil. Mary was able to turn a place that had chains and whips and all kinds of torturous tools to a place that had desks and pencils and chalkboards to liberate her people, my people. And in terms of embracing ancestral pride, I just want to remind us that even our most venerated activists took time for care. So Audre Lorde loved to be outside. Alicia Garza, she loves fashion and she loves partaking in that. James Baldwin, he loved to go to the theater. Stacey Abrams, she likes to connect with her family. Toni Morrison, she could cut a rug. She was great at dancing. And Ida B. Wells loved to read. And so I know it might seem like we can't tap into that care, but we do have a history, and our current activists are talking more about how that care of self and that community care is so essential to what we do in this work. It sustains this work. And then in terms of envisioning equitable opportunities, I think it's very hard to imagine, right? And I want to remind you of a book I've been reading called Restless Resistance. Some of you might have heard of it, by Trissa Hersey. And she talks about how our culture has kind of hijacked our dream space, and how there's actually power in reclaiming your dream space. It's a liberatory practice. So many of the ancestors, or the ancestors of so many of you listening, have survived unimaginable situations by dreaming and envisioning. And I also want to remind you all of a quote by Deary McKenson, who talks about how, he gets very concerned about people saying that dreaming is foolish. Dreaming is something you shouldn't be doing. Well, when you think about it, someone had to have a wild imagination and dream space for oppression. Why can't we do the same for liberation? Dreaming is not foolish. Dreaming is therapeutic. Dreaming saves many of us. You have permission to dream. And then finally, the last component of radical hope that has been sustaining me is just knowing that the commitment that I have made is a long-term commitment. And I challenge us to think about what will our commitment to just social justice look like in open ed in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? What message do we want to communicate? Bell Hooks reminds us in her All About Love, famous book, All About Love, that all the great social movements for freedom and justice in our society have promoted a love ethic. And I often end my talks with this because at the center of what we do, y'all, it is love. Love is what sustains what we are doing here. The anger, the anxiety, the frustration that might get us into what we're doing. But if we want to be in this long term, y'all, we got to figure out, how do we center love in our work? And so I know I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, but thank you all so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking and sharing some of my ideas. Thank you for showing me grace. There's my contact information. I know folks aren't on Twitter anymore. I'm occasionally on there. You can find me there. But yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Someone said obsessed. Thank you. Oh, wow. Maybe if we can take one question, 1 or 2 questions. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Let me see.
Jasmine, we're actually going to go ahead and give you a little bit more time because of the technical difficulties. So
Okay.
if anyone would like to stay behind and questions can go into the break, that is totally fine. Please feel welcome to put your questions in the Q&A.
Oh, yes, I can put up the last slide. Absolutely. Oh, tears. Stop it, Kathy. Okay. Was it this slide or was it the other slide? I hope it was. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Kathy.
Jasmine, we have a question in the Q&A. It says,
Awesome.
about Florida politics, how can we in Florida work with the DEI frameworks used within OER, open pedagogy, and similar efforts and still move forward when confronted by state authority?
Yeah, that is a great question that I don't know if I have an answer to. I have to be very honest with you. Because we are seeing similar things happen in Ohio. Ohio has been called the Florida of the North. I don't know how to really take that. One of the things that, yeah, Charlotte, yes. One of the things that, and I don't want to get too like legal, but one of the things that I have been thinking about as an educator is looking at what do policies and law, what do they not say about my work that then I can still do my work, right? So we're focusing so much on like what these policies, this new legislative backlash is saying, but what I have found some hope in a little bit is, okay, but it doesn't say X, Y, and Z, right? And so me looking at it from that angle has been helpful. Me acknowledging that a pause, and I don't mean in the sense of like going away from the work, but giving myself grace and pausing with this moment has been tremendously helpful, because I think there's an instinct to just keep going. And I think there is value in that when you have a sense of where you are going. However, what has been helpful to me is just to pause and really process this moment. And I don't think sometimes we know that's even an option, if that makes any sense. I know that's not probably the best answer because, like I said earlier, I don't have a nice packaged answer because, to be quite honest with you, here in Ohio, and I know some of my colleagues in Oklahoma, in Georgia, obviously we mentioned Florida, are going through very, very similar things. I think it's something that I'm still trying to figure out, if I'm being very transparent with you. But again, it's that radical hope that's been sustaining me and giving myself grace in the sense of like, I can pause right now and reposition. I don't have to keep going. If that makes any sense.
We had a question in the chat earlier that somebody asked, is there also an issue with, quote, acknowledgement inflation, unquote, as something that consumes increasing social justice, time, labor, and energy?
Can you read the question again? I didn't quite understand it.
Yeah, is there also an issue with acknowledgement inflation as something that consumes increasing social justice, time, labor, and energy?
I don't know why I feel like I'm not quite understanding
I think
that.
if anyone had that question, if they would like to clarify in the chat, we can come back to it.
I think because I don't want to not answer it correctly.
Okay, whoever had asked that question, if you want to clarify
Yes,
in the
please,
chat.
please, because I want to be able to answer it.
And we will absolutely come back to it. Okay, so the next question we have is, can you say more about the air between the branches, please? That is a wonderful image that I want to
Oh,
start thinking about.
yeah, I just wonder what beauty, not to sound like that person, but I just wonder what beauty is it in noticing. Just taking like I've been thinking a lot about just like I don't know if y'all heard the term like noticing walks, where you literally just walk outside and just notice your environment. Oh, there's a tree, there's the sidewalk. Like it's very mundane, but it actually helps to ground you. And so I use that nature analogy because I think there's a lot of grounding that needs to take place in open ed in terms of just noticing all these different other pathways, all these different, how do I say this? Pathways, yes, but there's a better word that I want to use. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that I don't want us to get locked in and just looking at the branches because we miss so much beauty in terms of like the function of air, the function of wind, right? If we're going to use that nature analogy. And so I'm thinking about how do we also apply that to our work in open education in terms of like thinking about all these other different functions and pathways and how that can elevate our work as well. But yeah, that nature analogy dawned on me because I was doing a noticing walk and it took a bird actually flying through the two branches that I was looking at for me to be like, there's a whole wind space there. And it was beautiful to me. Right. And so I'm just wondering, what does it take for us to notice that in between space as well? Because I feel like we could be missing a lot if we don't look in between those spaces.
Beautiful. What are some tangible ways that people can use to move towards OER and awareness/justice in a state that is majority white or European descent people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think the first thing is there is a tendency to want to act right now. And I know that that tendency comes from a very good place. But we have to recognize that a lot of what I'm saying and a lot of what other scholars of color have been saying, we are not taught these things. And so I encourage people, I love this quote, I can't remember who said it, but I think it was mentioned in the Rios community that I was working with. This work is too urgent to rush. And so the reason why I bring that up is because I do believe that there's a lot of value in just sitting with this information and unlearning some of this socialization in terms of like how we're socialized into this society, how we're socialized in terms of an academic culture. There's a lot of value in educating yourself, right? We kind of learned about that in the OE Global Conference in terms of like before you ask someone to educate you, educate yourself. And so all that to say, I think even before getting to the tangible, this is what you need to do. I think the first thing is to sit and to figure out what does that process of unlearning and relearning look like for you. Because I think if we don't do that, the whole like, we need to do this, that, and the third, there's no framework, there's no grounding for that. So I do want to caution people from, I think there's value in that. I think that's a very good question. And if I can use the power of the and I think there's also value in the pre-work, right? I think there's a lot of value in that. Yeah, holding the urgency, Amy said. Yeah. Yes, look it up. This work is too urgent to rush. I didn't say that. You don't have to quote me. Look it up on Google. But I take note in that question because that's actually a question I asked in one of the sessions yesterday where a local school district, local to me at least, Reynoldsburg School District, they're doing some great OER work and Socratic, style learning. Like it's really, really dynamic. And I asked the question of, it makes sense in a very diverse school district that these issues would be talked about. How do we talk about this in a predominantly white environment, right? So there's this notion that people of color, they're forced to have this racial literacy. And in the US context, unfortunately, I am being very US based, there's this level of, white people, white Americans don't have to have this racial literacy because whiteness is the norm. So how do we get this in a space of whiteness, which in a lot of ways might be needed even more. And so that's something that I'm thinking about, especially in light of just the political legislation as well. But I think doing still that pre-work is very, very helpful.
Two more super amazing questions. One is, this was fabulous. I love that you push DEI activists to be explicit about actual justice as the goal for our shared work. Would you like to say more about what it looks like to go beyond DEI to discussing justice itself?
Mm-hmm. I always use, not always, I shouldn't say that. I sometimes say, I think D&I is the first step, right? So you can have representation in your classroom, but if your classroom still mimics and centers, for example, whiteness, or whatever the dominant culture is in your cultural context, I'm not sure if you're actually getting towards justice, right? So it's not enough to say that we have X amount of students in our classroom, we have X amount of students or X amount of faculty, in our what am I trying to say, in our school. How are we transforming the actual policies? How are you transforming the curriculum? And how do we actually do education? I think that's what justice gets at, that D&I doesn't. And I can't remember who it was. I do so many things, y'all. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. I think I was with Mahabali and a few other colleagues. It might have been an Equity Unbound meeting I was in. But anyways, there was someone in the meeting who said, when we're talking about inclusion, included into what? I think that's another, that question of included into what is a very valuable question. Included into a dominant culture? Does inclusion mean assimilation? These are terms that we need to unpack. And so for me, justice is tackling the equitable distribution of resources. Justice is tackling the policies, the system, right? And not just the tangible things that we see. And so that's why I often talk about justice, because you can have diverse representation and still, reinforce unjust or unjust policies and practices in your classroom, in your, whatever situation environment that you're in, which really undermines, right, the work that we're trying to do. So
Thank
diversity
you.
is not enough. It's step one. Sorry.
It's okay. Absolutely. Okay, last question. If we could answer this one super quickly so that folks can go ahead and go on to their breaks. And love this one from a 19-year-old student. What are 3 books you'd recommend, nonfiction or fiction?
Ooh, okay. So y'all see my wife and I's messy bookcase. The House of Eve by, I think you pronounce her name Sidika Johnson, I think. The House of Eve. It's about 2 Black girls in the 1950s and their just journey into motherhood. Oh, you just read that? Oh, I loved it. I loved it too. It was really, really good. I'm trying to think of another book. I did just read Sidika's other book, Yellow Wife, who's it's based on Mary Lumpkin's story, the woman that I mentioned in the talk. That is kind of a rough read. The House of Eve is a little bit lighter. All About Love, Bell Hooks. I mean, that I don't it's just such a beautiful, it's almost gonna make me cry. My wife actually gifted that to me in our first year of dating. So shout out to Sydney, like had never even like heard of the book and she gifted it to me. And then the third book, I would say, I'm trying to think of a light book. I tend to read kind of heavy things, so I'm trying to think of a lighter book. Oh, The Lost Girls. It's about women who love to travel and they traveled all over the world. Basically, I don't want to give too much of it away, but yeah, The Lost Girls is a really nice, light read, and that's a fictional book.
Jasmine, thank you so much. Stephanie, can I pass it on to you to close us out?
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dana. Thank you so much, Jasmine. It's been wonderful having you. I really appreciate you staying along and answering some questions. It's time for a little bit of a break, and then we'll be back with more sessions. And we hope that you've really enjoyed day 2 of this conference, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.